All right, let's get back into the final lap of this town hall with President Trump, and we'll go to the next question. Bret Baier mentions that former Vice President Joe Biden has tweeted out that Trump destroyed all preparations that the Obama administration had made for pandemics. Biden said that they had created a playbook and Trump ignored it, that they had created an office to deal with pandemics, that Trump gutted it, and that they had placed CDC representatives in China to help stop the spread of viruses and such, and that Trump had pulled them out. Trump's response is that along with a number of other Democrats, Joe Biden said that when he closed the borders to China back in January, late January, that he was being xenophobic and racist to do so. He doesn't really respond specifically to this idea that they had created an office and he had gutted it one way or another. Doesn't really respond to the idea that they had a playbook for pandemics, nor does he respond to the idea of having CDC people in China and having pulled them out. So I'm not sure about answers to those questions. What I can go back to is people like Fauci who are, treated like the sexiest people alive, have said as recently as February 28th not to worry about the virus, that there was no problem with it. And conceivably he's connected to a number of people around the world, and he is a representative that would be advising the White House. So it's a little hard to believe that they didn't have people who were aware of what was going on in other parts of the world, unless they were just, sticking their head in the sand, so to speak, and ignoring it. As far as leaving supplies, there's a number of cases where Democrats and even the United States did not have any supplies stockpiled in the event of a pandemic. So it's a little nonsensical for Biden to say that they left a playbook. They can leave a playbook, but if you don't have anything to operate that playbook with, if you don't have supplies to work with, then obviously you didn't completely leave it prepared for dealing with a pandemic. You creating an office doesn't mean anything if that office doesn't have protocols that they follow. And we have yet to see any proof of a playbook one way or another from Joe Biden about dealing with this. We've seen how the Trump administration has dealt with it, but we've never heard of any playbook from Biden or from Obama. They didn't actually have any playbook when it came back to H1N1 back in 2009, 2010. They didn't close borders. They didn't do anything like that to prevent the spread of it. So I think Biden's statement definitely has some things you could question in it. Next, Trump gets a question from a man named Rob in Columbus, Ohio, who states that the COVID-19 pandemic is disproportionately affecting people of color. Trump further expands on that by saying not just African Americans, but also Asian Americans and Hispanic Americans are being affected by it. So Rob asks, what is your administration doing to assist in that? So I'm not sure what Trump can do to affect this. What Trump says, though, is we're coming out with a report in 2 weeks that's going to address that, because you're right, it is very disproportionate. In fact, it's amazing, he says. It's amazing. It's not amazing. It's kind of like trying to say, old people are affected. Like saying, it's disproportionately going after aged people. Well, there's questions as to why that's happening then. So is it something, does it more dominantly hit the older community? because of the condition of their immune systems? Is it possible that that's the reason that there are more people who are affected in communities that have, people of different ethnicities? Is that the reason possibly it's happening? What is the reason it's happening is kind of so open because it's so, you have to understand the logic of a virus and how it's defined and made up completely. And you never truly completely understand that. You're going to have to find so many aspects and define so many aspects to it. And not only within the virus, but also within those communities. And so you're going to have to look at those communities and figure that out. You're going to have to look at, and is it disproportionately affecting all African Americans around the state or around the country? The answer would be no, because there are states with African Americans in it that aren't having the same numbers of effects. There are parts of the United States with Asian Americans that aren't being affected. There's a reason for that. And Hispanic Americans and white Americans and Native American Americans. It's just impossible to define it. It is obviously, without knowing anything about science, but just deductive reasoning, it would have to be a couple of things causing it. One would have to be environmental, and second would have to be the virus itself. So without knowing the link between them, there's no way you're going to be able to find out exactly what's causing it. It just may be standards within that area that's making it, there's more contamination in those cities or wherever it's being affected. It's just impossible to know those things. There's too many aspects you can never resolve. And Trump doesn't really answer the question. He just sort of says, we're coming out with a report in 2 weeks. Well, in 2 weeks, there's more people who are going to be dead if it's disproportionately affecting people of different ethnicities than Caucasian in the United States. It's 2 more weeks of death. That doesn't really answer the question. That just sort of like, well, we'll have some answers in 2 weeks. Well, answers in 2 weeks is not what the guy's looking for. He's looking for answers now. So, but I don't think there is an answer. So I don't think you can call him, a guy who can resolve the problem, because nobody knows what it is. You're suggesting a virus has a racial or ethnic bias, but it doesn't. It's affected Germans. It's affected Chinese people. It's affected people in Europe. It's affected people in other parts of the world, France, Italy. It doesn't have this, like, they're trying to, like, almost put the virus as racist in some way. And it's impossible to cause a virus racist because a virus doesn't have emotion. It's a virus. To suggest that it's even created to be racist would mean you'd have to say it's being racist against Chinese people. You don't think white people or Caucasian people are dying for this? It's racist against Italians. Okay. There's a lot of Italians who are Caucasians, so I guess maybe it's racist towards everybody. You ever thought about that? It's really a trap to walk into. It's disproportionately affecting people of color. Black people, Asian people, Mexican people. It's affecting them. It's racist. It's a trap. He can't solve the problem because nobody can solve the problem. There's no answer as to why. Like I said, it's part the virus and part environmental, and somehow their connection. That's kind of why you're seeing the problems in nursing homes. You have people in an environment that's already filled with a lot of, varying conditions, weakened immune systems, and the virus gets in and runs rampant all over it. In some way, in communities that have people who happen to be black or Asian or Mexican or whatever, apparently there's something within that community that's allowing that to happen. But it's not in every community of black people. It's not in every community of Asian people. It's not in every community of Hispanic people. It's not in every community of every people. So it's really just a trap, and you shouldn't fall for it. Next, Trump is posed a question by a man named Trip Gribby, who is a freshman at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And his question is, if you're reelected, what are you going to do to take more fiscal responsibility, especially in the situation now we have where we've been spending a lot of money for COVID-19? Okay, so Trump's response is, well, we have we're going to cut back on spending. Okay, we'll get into that in a minute. He says that the reasons he believes he was elected were border security, trade, and the military, which has nothing to do with fiscal responsibility, by the way. That's more, well, in a way, trade does. And in a way, border security does. But the military is really more protection for the United States. But he says we have billions coming every year from Japan, which translates into about $40 billion because of a deal related to, automobiles and such. He says that the new USMCA Act is going to help us financially in deals that we didn't. It was like 1.2 or $3 trillion, as I recall, back in the day. I can't remember, but over a certain period of years, it was going to be 1 to 1.3 trillion dollars, if I remember it correctly. He also talks about new tariffs on other countries, and then he kind of goes into talking about NATO, which NATO has nothing to do with our spending. We spend money with NATO, voluntarily. They're not making us. We're choosing to put the money into NATO. You could cut that back at any time. He said that he's getting other countries to pay more, which may cut down how much the United States is putting into it. And finally, he did reduce the amount of money, or withheld approximately $500 million every year to go to the WHO, because they seem like they've been just in bed with China, which they have. Okay, so let's just go back a little bit. The first thing he said was that they're going to do cutbacks. Well, he doesn't have the full authority to do cutbacks. And he is not doing cutbacks every time he agrees with Democrats and they get money for unnecessary monies to spend on the Kennedy Center and all these other, PBS and the like. When you're spending $350 million here, $25 million here, that all adds up. And you're not cutting back on spending when you allow those things to continue. So you can't say we're cutting back on spending, because if you don't take a hard line, you're always going to be nickel and diming with those things. And every nickel and dime adds up to dollars and adds up to billions. And we're at, as of the time of this recording, they said we're at a $25 trillion in debt. Trillion. Okay, if you get $40 billion from China, that's 40% of $1 billion. So you could say we're down to 24 trillion, 600 or 960 billion. Okay. We're not getting that much we're getting some, but not a lot from China. Let's just be fair and say we're going to be getting 250 billion from China. 250 billion from China would mean that we're now at 24 trillion, 810 billion. You saved your 500 million basically with the WHO. That takes you down to $24,809,500,000,000. 500 million. I mean, my point is that, it does add up to something, but it doesn't add enough to offset the expenses that are going into doing all this. The way to offset expenses and to bring the debt down. Oh, and I should add before I go into that, the other problem is he's talking about 40 billion here, and then the tariffs here, or this other state, and taxes we're charging this country, and yada yada yada. It's not going to be the same amount this year as it would be in a profitable year if the market, and it would stand for every year. Whenever there is a decline in the market, the amount of money they're going to be giving to you is going to be different. They don't just say we're going to give you 250 billion every year, irregardless of what happens. That's not how it's working. It's based on estimates of how much business they will do with the United States in that year. So it may be 40 billion, last year, for example, but this year it's definitely not going to be 40 billion because the market's already been affected. So maybe it's 30 billion. So that's not going to offset the debt the way it needs to. So this idea that you're going to cut back spending is a great concept, but you actually have to execute it. And you're not executing it every time you let Democrats or Republicans talk you into these little pet projects that the government should not be in charge of. The federal government should not be involved in financially holding up Planned Parenthood. It should not be financially involved in holding up any particular organization, whether it be a religious or a medical organization in that way. The only time the federal government should be involved in people's situations like that is when saying you have the right to practice religion, whatever religion you believe is right for you, as long as it does not hurt other people. You can do whatever you want to do with, your religion. That's fine. But it should not be saying we're going to support any particular procedures unless it is about doing research into the development of cures for diseases and such. The federal government should not be involved in holding up governments in every way. The federal government is supposed to help provide guidelines for the nation as long as we are, united in a common belief system. If that common belief system changes so dramatically, then the United States ceases to be united, which means that eventually they will split off, which I believe they will eventually anyway, because there's too many divisive views between this state and another. What happens in New York does not happen in Texas, at least not for the most part. Florida doesn't happen the same as what happens in Washington state, for example. So the United States federal government is supposed to be, sort of providing the guidelines based on the standards of the country. It's not supposed to be getting involved in bailing out states or whatever else. That's where governors are supposed to be the leaders of their colony, so to speak. And the federal government could cut back spending if they would stop spending money on pet projects that are related to New York or to Texas or to Florida or wherever. The federal government should not be involved in pet projects, and it should not be involved in the overall financing of any particular type of project, like abortion, because there's states that don't believe in abortion, which means that unless it's a universal opinion to support the abortion process, the federal government should not be involved in it. It should be up to the states, and as long as they have that leeway that says right to life in the federal statutes, it says you have a right to life to do it, then that means that state can go in and financially put in the money to support that program, right? And if the state goes into debt because they do it, then it's the responsibility of the citizens in that state to elect new officials who will not continue to perpetuate that debt. But the federal government should not be involved in it. That's how you balance a budget. Get out of all the little projects in all the different states and just focus on big picture stuff only. Don't get into this thing of right to life and this. If you want to establish, say, a right to life, or you have, freedom of choice, and that is going to be a standard for the country, then that's fine. But if you wanted to get into, we're going to financially support Planned Parenthood, no, that's not how you should be working it. You should not be supporting Planned Parenthood as a federal government. You could say, these are the guidelines we've decided as the country. Now, if you as a state wants to do something for Planned Parenthood, then put it in your budget and create it, and and go and do it that way. And if it works out and your budget stays balanced, then great. If it doesn't, then you better hire new people, hire whatever new people who will help to balance it. But the government, the federal government, should not be bailing out the states in this situation. When there's, force majeure, like acts of God or natural disasters, that's one thing. That's why the states are supposed to contribute back to the federal government so that the federal government can continue to help in the events. It's almost like a rainy day fund. You know what I mean? In a lot of ways, they need to have, the federal government maintains a rainy day fund, if it was responsible, would maintain a rainy day fund so that in the events of, force majeure, they can come in and assist. But otherwise, and also so they can help to contribute to the payment for national defense and research into, cures for viruses and such. But otherwise, the federal government needs to look at big picture stuff. And right now, federal government is not looking at big picture. So I went off on a rant there, but my point is that he cannot claim they're going to do cutbacks as long as they're getting involved in little pet projects. It's just not possible. He can save money by getting good deals, but if you're offsetting it with excessive spending on pet projects and small things that really need to be the responsibility of the states, you'll never get the federal debt under control. Next, Martha MacCallum asks Trump about a target date for making more of our medical supplies here within the United States instead of abroad. Trump mentions that we approximately have 95% of our drugs are made internationally, some made in China, some made in Ireland, and yada, yada. He says that, he would like to see it done within 2 years. He said, I think we'll have it done within 2 years. He also says that you're really hurting my position by asking me a question like that because it takes away my negotiating ability. And he's right about that. That really isn't, I understand the need for the question and the curiosity for the question. But say, well, I can't give you a target date because it depends a lot on negotiations, and that's it. And he should have walked away from it. That, of course, Trump does not know how to say a simple thing and walk away. He tends to, it is true, he does tend to ramble. He goes on to other things. He talks about how, it's like, he does mention we need a vaccine for the virus, and we're going to get a vaccine, and I don't care who does it as long as we get a vaccine for the virus. MacCallum asks him if there's any kind of incentives that he can offer. Well, this is kind of going back to the previous rant I just did about the federal government. Incentives are something that you could offer to a company to manufacture drugs and let them pick the state that they want to go to and then just give them a general federal write-off that they want to use. And then they can go to whatever state they want to in the union to settle. And you just give them a across the board write-off on federal expenses or income tax or whatever, and it doesn't matter what state they go to. So then that way, states can begin bidding to secure that, factory or wherever else it's going to be, to make it more advantageous for them to go there. So incentives are good things. But once again, the federal government should have a kind of a unilateral, benefit or incentive that says, okay, we'll give you 10% off of your federal income costs, and then let the states go at it to try and benefit them further. So Texas can say, well, we'll give you a 10% discount on state taxes, or we don't have a state tax like New York does. New York could say, well, we won't charge you any state tax. We'll give you that discount if you'll produce here in New York or whatever it is. So they have that choice, and that's what the states should be doing. Should not be the federal government's responsibility to handle all of that. It should be they're finding ways to incentivize them to manufacture in the United States. At this point, Trump is joined by Mike Pence and Secretary of Treasury Steve Mnuchin. And Baier asks Trump the question he poses a question to him from a lady named Kylie Patterson out of Baltimore. And she is the head of economic inclusion at Johns Hopkins. And she asks, President Trump, have you considered doing an infrastructure bill to help rebuild our cities, our roads and highways as a way of getting people back to work? Okay, so first off, Trump, I'm just going to answer for him for a second. Trump's already been talking about that for a long time. Have you been paying attention? Are you paying attention to what he actually says, or are you just listening to what other news sources are telling you? He's been saying that on his campaign trail since 2016. Now, mind you, he hasn't gotten anything done, but he can't do it all by himself. He has to work with Congress to pass bills to do things like this. And gets back into the weeds again. Anyways, Trump's response is, yes, he wants to do something with infrastructure. He actually thinks that that's great because the Democrats and Republicans both share a desire to do something about infrastructure he believes in, so he thinks that can be done. He says that one of the things he does want, though, in the process of doing an infrastructure bill, is he wants a payroll tax cut. So I think that that's logical too. But anyways, then Pence says, as a follow-up, he says, I'd also like to say that I believe that reopening America is going to help people with the jobless claims. We were over 30 million as of last week. We'll probably go up to 33, 34 million as of like Thursday this week. We'll find out. It usually comes out on Thursday or Friday. Anyway, so he says, reopening America, Pence is saying this, reopening America will help us to take care of those, issues with people not being able to work, getting people back to work in a responsible manner with the social distancing, with the mitigation. And then also he says he agrees with President Trump, who believes that the following year, he calls it, meaning next year, that it will be one of the best years ever in the history of the United States. So I don't want to jump back into the weeds again, but you already know what I'm saying about the federal government being involved in every little pet project that happens around the state. States should be taking care of their highways. If there is a highway that is deemed a national highway, let's say I-10, for example, because I-10 travels, I know it's here in Texas and goes all the way into California, which means it goes across Arizona, it goes into California, right? That would be a national highway. That's something I think the federal government could get involved with. But like here in Houston, for example, What is it also called? IH-35. I think IH-35, as I recall, IH-35, which runs through Texas and Austin, actually goes into, does it go into Florida? I don't want to lie, but I think it runs into Florida, but I think it runs into another state for sure. If it's, if it runs into 2 or more states, it would definitely be considered a national highway. If it only lives within that state or within a city, for example, we have what's called here in Houston the 610 Loop. We also have, I think it's called Grand Parkway, 99. And that is an interstate form of transportation, okay, a way of moving about. That should not be the federal government's responsibility to take care of. That should be a part of the budget for the state government to handle. They should find ways of incentives. They shouldn't sell excessively overexpensive contracts to people and have very little to show in return for it. In Houston, there have been millions and millions of dollars put out. Millions of dollars put out to address the issues we have with like potholes and broken roads here, and very little has been done. It happens right around election time. Do you see anything significant happening? And you can look at these construction crews on the road when you're traveling by, and you can see they're half butting it all the time. They're not working that hard. They're standing around talking to each other. They're doing a little of this, a little of that, put on a little show here and there. These people are being overpaid. There needs to be better control of these contracts and all that. I don't want to get into the weeds anymore, but what I'm saying is, bottom line, federal government should only be involved in infrastructure as far as it comes to fixing roads that affect multiple states. When it comes to the local states, this is where you have a spending issue again. You can cut the payroll tax and help the American people that way to where they put more money back into the market, which will increase the state's coffers and increase the national coffers as well as a result of the states paying into the federal government coffers for rainy day and for research and military and all that stuff. But as far as getting into different states and fixing their infrastructure, that should not be the responsibility of the federal government. That's how you get further debt. The states should be responsible. And if the states are not responsible, you fire the people via an election or through as the administrator, the leader, the governor of the state. And that's how you resolve the issue. You don't let the federal government take care of your problems when that's your job. That's why you were elected. To keep the costs down, to build up, a surplus in the event that we need it, to balance the budget. They keep pushing this off on the federal government, and the federal government keeps going for it. It's not the federal government's responsibility to fix every road. It's just not. Then Baier poses to Secretary Mnuchin about what are you going to do to help out Americans who are struggling during this time. Mnuchin mentions that they've already given out, they've had a $3 trillion to inject into the market to try and help. Now, remember, some of that, like $350 million of that, went to like PBS and to other pet projects. $25 million going to the Kennedy Center, which said they were going to become like a center to help people who were going through the COVID-19 virus, and yet then they started laying off their staff. So $25 million. That means that on average, if you take, he mentions at one point they've already given out $2.1 billion billion. I'm sorry, I take that back. $2.1 million to small businesses under 85,000. Well, $2.1 million under 85,000 when you gave $25 million to the Kennedy Center? Do you have any small businesses you could have saved, sole proprietors you could have saved with $25 million and you gave it to the Kennedy Center? And you funded unemployment to the point where people are making more money to do nothing? I mean, how do you call that even slightly fiscally responsible? And don't tell me I had to negotiate with them. You didn't have to negotiate with anybody. You could have said in the press over and over and over again, you could have gone to CNN and all of them and said, let me come on the air and I'll talk about what you want. And then I would have just slipped in. Oh, and by the way, guess what? The Democrats wanted $25 million for the Kennedy Center. You could have resisted it. And when people got pissed at you, you go, look, do you want me to give you money or not? See, that's the problem with it. That's the problem with the American people are so uneducated in a majority sense about what's going on here. All they hear is what they hear on CNN and on Fox News and in MSNBC and yada yada. And the problem is they're uneducated or they're just denied the information. Can't even completely blame it on the American people because the news doesn't want people to know it. A lot of news sources don't want you to know that they wanted $25 million for the Kennedy Center or $350 million for PBS. Right now is not the time to fund PBS. Right now is not that time. Right now is not time to fund the Kennedy Center. Right now is the time to take care of people that are suffering financially in the United States. That $375 million, which could have been more like $725 million because of the other projects that escape my mind at the moment that they were funding during all this crap. Do you know how many people's livelihoods that could have saved? How many sole proprietors that could have saved? But the news doesn't want to talk about that. And that's what the problem is with the news. All sides of this. You've got to talk about where these problems are. You've got to talk about how they're overfunding unemployment. But they don't want to talk about that because there are so many people. And yes, it's Democrats. I'm sorry to tell you, and you don't have to like it. And I don't really give a crap if you like it or not. But Democrats want to do a universal pay to people. So basically they work for the United States government. No. You don't want people working for the United States government because then as soon as they are tied to the government paying them, that means the government sets the rules for them, and it's not about what the people want anymore. It's about what the government gives you. You want private industry. You don't want universal pay, universal health care, because then they're choosing who lives, who dies. They're deciding what you get and how they'll give it to you. And if you don't vote their way, well, then they'll just take it away from you in one way or another. That's why private industry is so important. But for him to sit up here and say, well, we gave $2.1 million to, businesses under 85,000. Well, whoopity and do. You could have done 10 times that if you hadn't given money to the Kennedy Center. And once again, I can't blame him for it. But $2.1 million when you got $3 trillion and you're talking about 85,000 small businesses, a lot of them are under 85,000. That's probably a majority of them are under 85,000. So it's absurd. It's absurd to say that you're helping that many people when you talk about how you've given $2.1 million to small businesses. And over $3 trillion has been, passed in legislation. Now, I know more has gone to some bigger businesses, but like I said, the majority of small businesses are under $100,000 a year. That's where the money should be going to. Next, a gentleman by the name of Phil Tokoff, who is the owner of Tokoff Food Products, which is in 4 states, Tennessee, South Carolina, Florida, and Georgia, asks, or rather states, that he is spending over $60,000 every month in additional expenses for tariffs that would be better directed during this time or long term into hiring workers, into buying new equipment, and to recovering from the current economic situation. He's asking if the president would consider temporarily or permanently removing these tariffs. Trump says that a lot of that money is going to farmers. Wasn't that far back, 5 or 6 years ago, that we were paying over $544 billion a year in tariffs to China, not to mention the ones that were being paid to Canada and other countries when we were allowing products to come in here for free. So he's saying a lot of that money is going back to the farmers, and all the farmers want is a level playing field. So he understands what the need is. But he asked what Phil's going through, but he's also saying a lot of that money is going back to balance the playing field with farmers, and that's all they want is a balanced playing field with Canada, with China, with other countries that they do business with. So this is where this guy basically wants bigger profits. I don't believe for one second this guy is worried that $60,000 a month he's going to use to hire more workers, because if his demand is higher, he'll hire more workers. It's not about his demand. His demand is not the problem. He doesn't want $60,000 more a month so he can hire more workers, because if his demand was higher, he'd hire more workers anyway. Okay? He wants to put more equipment in. If he's not making as much as he needs now, then he can streamline his staffing and redirect funds for that. But I don't believe for one second this guy is actually concerned about hiring more workers. I think that's a BS statement, because he wants $60,000 more a month in profit. And that's fine. If you want $60,000 more a month in profit, find a way to make it. It's ridiculous to say that you want $60,000 more a month and to use the excuse that it's so you can hire more workers. Right now, you don't need to hire more workers anyway. Unless your demand is high, and the demand in the market is high, you don't need to hire more workers right now. You're probably eliminating more workers. That $60,000 you're paying in tariffs is offset by the fact that that American companies are paying billions of dollars a year into China and Canada to send them products. So you're getting it on this side of paying. They're getting on the other side of having to pay. Don't whine about it. Just the way it is. The only way to avoid that is if China cut down on tariffs and the United States cut down on tariffs. Expecting the United States to stop charging tariffs, but not expecting China to stop is unreasonable. I refuse the value of your question, because I think it has very little to do with your concern about economic recovery and more of your profit margin. Baier follows up on the statement by Phil Tokoff by asking Trump if he's considering enforcing more tariffs on China. Trump says, that's really the ultimate or minimal. He says both, actually. It's the ultimate or the minimal way to impact another country's economy and to show them that you're not going to be taken advantage of. So he says he's not going to eliminate the tariffs because that's part of our control, and it's part of China's control too, and Canada and other countries that do business with us. If we don't charge them tariffs, but they get to charge us tariffs, then we're basically suckers in the whole process. We're suckers in the whole process. Maybe this guy, Phil Tokoff, instead of buying stuff from China, he should buy it from the United States. Then he won't be paying that $60,000 a month in tariffs. And if he is saying that it's cheaper for him to buy it from China or wherever he's buying it from internationally, because he's paying a tariff, if he's saying it's cheaper to buy it from them than it is to buy it in the United States, then guess what? You already got a deal, buddy. You don't need another deal. You're already getting a deal because you're not paying the amount you say you'd be paying in the United States. Or if you're saying you don't have access to it, why don't you become the proprietor of that particular need in the United States and build on your company, build on the value of your company, and make it in America? But Trump's answer to tariffs is saying, look, it's a very complicated game. You know, it's poker, it's chess, it's not checkers. It's not. It is Monopoly, I guess. He didn't mention Monopoly. He didn't mention Connect 4 or Jenga or any of the other board games, but maybe their money went up. Who knows? But, you know, they say that him even mentioning tariffs on China caused a drop in the markets. Well, you know, the market is so volatile in a general sense. I mean, it goes up, it goes down, it goes up, it goes down, it goes up, it goes down. And we kept having to go up and go down and still hitting milestones all the time. You cannot be controlled by the emotion of the market, because the market's emotion changes. If Trump had not insisted on doing tariffs with other countries, do you think that our value in the United States would have gone up the way it has gone up over the last several years? China is getting away with so many things in the big picture. Now, their population is 3 times bigger than the United States. They have over 1 billion. We have 330 million if you look at the highest number of potentials. But they're paying nothing to us, and we're paying money to them. At least they have been until Trump started instituting this. We were in the World Health Organization. We were giving, with us having 1/3 of the population of China, we were paying $450 million to the World Health Organization, and China was paying $38 million. Now tell me that's not disproportionate. It's not our responsibility to fund all these organizations for other countries and for them to set policies that negatively affect our country. Let's just be reasonable. And the World Trade Organization is not potentially any better, because they haven't thought about the United States' interests in it. They've thought about all these other countries that do trade with us, but not about the United States. I think the World Trade Organization is a problem too. Trump needs to get back to what he said, America first. And yes, it's going to piss off other countries because they've been having they've been able to run roughshod over us for the last number of decades. But see, if you don't stop it, it gets worse, because they know you don't fight back. And that's why they don't like Trump, because he fights back when it comes to that stuff. Next, there's a gentleman named Moyes from Crawford who asked the question, do you believe there's enough evidence to say that this virus started in China, and what are you going to do to address that issue? Trump says, I don't think there's any doubt anymore that it came from China. He doesn't say under what circumstances, wet market, created in a lab, escaped from a lab. He's suggesting that it came from a lab, but not suggesting it was designed in a lab. But he talks about how he cut off people from coming to China, and then they just started going to Europe, and then China keeps shifting who's responsible for it. First, they say that U.S. soldiers were responsible, and that annoyed Trump. And then they started saying that Europe was responsible for the problem. See, this is why I have trouble believing that China did not develop this thing in a lab, because if they wanted to, show they were honest and had intellectual integrity, they would have said, "Look, it's something that came from our lab. We tried to stop it. We didn't do an effective job of doing it, and now we're doing what we can," but they don't want the liability of it. So you can say they're denying it so they can avoid liability, But when you could trace it back to them, that's the problem. And they could have stopped transit to other countries when they knew it was starting to get bad. They didn't do that. They didn't care to do that, which says to me they had no problem with it spreading. They figure, hey, what the hell? We can get other people involved in this. We can hurt other people. It won't just be us. And we've contained it within our country, so it won't get outside of Wuhan. We'll take care of our people. Our workers, the ones who make us money. So he talks about how, the United States has responded and how China is trying to blame other people. And he said there will be a report coming out fairly soon talking about what research the United States has done into this and what they've discovered. He also mentions that they did try to go in and China would not let them go in to do their own investigation. Of course they're not going to let you go in and do your own investigation. Why would they let you find out what they've been doing or their poor response to this? MacCallum follows up by saying, so do you think it was an accident or nefarious? And Trump says he thinks that it was an accident and that they were embarrassed. Okay, so he says, and then he thought that they decided, well, they blocked off transportation within China from Wuhan, so why Wuhan couldn't go to Beijing and other parts of China, but they didn't stop transportation in other parts of the world. See, that's, to me, clear that when it went from an embarrassment to an ops action, meaning now we're going to do something to hurt other countries because they don't know what we know. We've contained the problem, but now they can't contain the problem because they don't know what's coming. See, that's when it goes to a form of warfare, biological warfare. And then when you have the media only too happy to talk it up more, start scaring people, start doing lockdowns. It was said the other day, I heard someone say, this is a dry run for totalitarianism. And it's exactly right. The more you let these people have control over you, the more they will take from you. They're testing it, and then they're seeing a backlash, and so they're starting to step back, but they're still trying to keep it as long as they can. They're just trying to see, how much can they handle before they really push back, and they're really pushing back. Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan is refusing to give up her orders, and she should pay the political price for that, for stopping her economy from restarting again. It's dangerous for that woman to be in charge. Not because she's a woman, but she just happens to be one. But she's dangerous to be in charge of Michigan. She's destroying the livelihoods of so many people in Michigan. And there are a lot of African Americans in Michigan who are suffering for it. You want to talk about them being unduly affected by this coronavirus. Economically, they're being slaughtered by it. And it's hitting a lot of people who happen to be African American. And it's shameful that anybody's being affected by it. Next, Trump takes a question from a gentleman named Joe in Arlington, Texas, saying, what are we going to do to protect the safety of our passengers? And what would your future advice be to other presidents during a situation like this? So first, Trump says that he talks really more about, instead of talking about how to protect the safety of the passengers, he talks about how they've saved the airlines from going under by giving, $50 billion, or I think it was $50 billion in financial support to help them to get through this tough time, because the airlines are down over 95% in travel from last year as a result of this thing. So he didn't really answer the question about how to protect people. Now, since this interview, every airline, major airline in the United States, has now initiated a mandatory mask requirement within the airline and for passengers and crew on airlines, which means that you're eventually going to have some problems because wearing a mask for an extended period of time, especially in a closed area like that, is going to start causing breathing issues for people. People are going to start passing out from poor breathing situations and whatever else. That's just dangerous. Those masks are not helping people. And in fact, you may end up seeing a lot of people having issues where they're passing out and going unconscious because they can't breathe wearing the mask. And as soon as one person takes the mask off, the whole point of it is completely inconsequential for everyone. And it really is anyway. Okay, the masks just aren't helping anybody. It's a Wizard of Oz thing. I want to do one day a podcast called, face mask, gloves, and social distancing. Oh my, because it might as well be that. It's just a scare tactic. It's like a Wizard of Oz scare tactic. Look out for the flying monkeys. So that is something we need to be aware of, that the masks don't help. But he just talks really about the financial support they've done to help bail out the airlines. And then as far as future advice to future presidents is that keep things in America, because the more you let them be outsourced to other countries, the more likely you are to be easily leveraged by other countries. And that's absolutely correct. Can't debate or even add anything to that.